Amazon Prime's The Boys is one of my favorite superhero shows. Ever since I saw talks about the scene with Huey's old girlfriend Robin on social media, I had to see what all the noise online was about. And that was the best decision I made that day. Jump to the summer of 2022. After 8 weeks of anticipation for each new episode, I finally finished the season. And I enjoyed it for the most part, rewatched some episodes, and watched reaction videos to relive the hype of certain scenes again through other people. But after some time away from the show, I started to realize there were some plot points I didn't really like or didn't like the way they were executed, and I just ignored them at the time due to emotional attachment to the show blinding me from critiquing it. Now that the hype of the show has long since waned for me, there are some pressing issues I have with this season of The Boys, and I hope when season 4 comes out, these issues won't come up again in any form. For starters, the overall plot of Season 4 needs to stay coherent and avoid going off on unrelated tangents for too long. I'm of course talking about the subplot with Frenchie, Kimiko, and Frenchie's ex-girlfriend Cherie getting kidnapped by his old boss, Little Nina, due to Cherie stealing from her. Now, hearing me say that sounds crazy. You might be thinking, one of the main characters getting kidnapped and nearly killed along with 2 women he loves sounds like the exact opposite of plot disconnect. But here's the thing. This season has set up a plotline of Butcher and the boys looking for a way to take out Homelander following a clue about a soup gun they've been given from their investigation. The viewers are mainly invested in this story and what it leads to, so any deviations from that story have to either tie back to the main plot or not take up too much of an episode's runtime and or the audience's attention. For example, Mother's Milk is dealing with raising his daughter with a stepfather in the picture. His obsession in taking down Soups with Butcher in previous seasons put his family in grave danger, so his wife divorced him and moved on romantically. He's uncomfortable with his ex-wife's new boyfriend being around and subtly indoctrinating his daughter with a mindless love for Soups, but he can't bring himself to tell his daughter about his past to explain his hatred of them. That is, until this season forces him to make a choice and face his fears when he learns Soldier Boy, the Soup that killed his grandfather and nearly killed him as a child, is still alive and is the key to taking down Homelander. He gives Butcher all his secret research on Soldier Boy he's been hoarding on his own for years, which helped give the boys a lead. By the end of the season, MM takes down Soldier Boy and finally tells his daughter about her family's cruel past with Soups and his feelings towards them. In doing so, he feels at ease, implying he's finally free from his fear and anxiety that's held him hostage almost all his life.
Have you always had that?
One night, there was a ruckus outside. I looked out the window, and it was Soldier Boy. He had pulled up on some kids that were trying to boost the Benz. And so I run, wake up my granddad. Grandpa, it's Soldier Boy. Come look. Soldier Boy takes the Benz, and he hurls it through our house. It missed me by about 6 inches. But my grandpa, one minute he was there, and then he wasn't.
That's when this whole OCD shit started. I mean, I don't understand it.
All I know is that if I didn't check the burners 3 times a night, Soldier Boy would come back and kill the rest of us.
That is an example of a good subplot. Frenchie's subplot, however, does neither of the 2 things I listed earlier. Well, to be technical, it does relate to the main plot in a small way, but I'll get to that later. A quick recap on his subplot. Frenchie is approached by Cherie at a park, and she tells him she stole drugs from Little Nina and plans to run away, hoping he'll join her. He refuses, choosing once and for all to be with Kimiko. In the meantime, Nina is on the hunt for Cherie. Sometime after the boys went to Russia and found out the soup gun they've been looking for was Soldier Boy, a soup everyone thought was dead, Frenchie goes to the hospital to check up on Kimiko. This is because after they found Soldier Boy, his freak attack left Kimiko powerless and severely injured. While at the hospital, Nina sneaks up on Frenchie. Thanks to all the chaos the boys made in Russia, it costed her several of her trusted contacts. So to settle Frenchie's new debt, she tells him to kill a man and his young daughter by the end of the day. He refuses, so Nina has her men kidnap him and Kimiko. Later at a warehouse, Frenchie is dragged in naked and learns both Kimiko and Cherie were kidnapped as well. He's given a choice to save one girl and have the other killed, or else all 3 of them will die. He can't decide, and as he's about to get shot, Kimiko breaks out of her rope tie and kills Nina's guards while Nina runs away, never to be seen or mentioned again for the rest of the season. There's a bit more in this subplot involving Kimiko, especially at the end, but I'll touch on that later, and you'll see why when the time comes. But with that, that's Frenchie's subplot summarized as briefly as possible. Now, going back to my 2 points of a good subplot, you can see how little Frenchie's plot does to follow either of them. For starters, after the entire ordeal is done and over with, Frenchie and Kimiko don't tell anyone from the boys what they went through. There was a scene where Frenchie and MM had an almost heart-to-heart about what's going on in both of their lives at the moment. MM asks Frenchie why he looks so disheveled, and Frenchie had the opportunity to tell MM what happened, but instead, he brushes it aside like it's nothing. To be fair, MM does the same when Frenchie asks him a similar question, but my point still stands. And near the end of the season, when Kimiko asks Starlight to steal Compound V from Vought so she can get her powers back, Starlight asks why she wants them back when she felt so happy without them. Kimiko just responds by telling her she just wants to be able to protect the people she loves, and she can't do that without her powers, completely glossing over her kidnapping ordeal. At this point in the show, our main characters have been working together for over a year now. I get Kimiko may not fully trust Starlight or any of the other boys members to share details of such a traumatic experience with them. She might see them at the same level as a co-worker, and that's fine. But I cannot say the same for Frenchie and MM. They've worked together for years, long before the events of the show. And although they had their issues back in Season 1 over the deaths of Mallory's grandkids, by Season 2 they hashed it out when Frenchie decided to trust in MM and share sensitive details going on in his personal life on the day Mallory's grandkids were killed. While we're at it, MM, Frenchie, and Butcher know each other so well, they know all about Frenchie's sexual proclivities and can joke about it. To you guys watching this video, let me ask, how many of your own co-workers would trust you with that kind of information about their personal lives? Even ones that have worked with you for years. At the same time, how many of them do you trust to know that kind of info about yourself? That shows how close these guys are to each other, like brothers in arms. Which confuses things all the more when Frenchie decides to hide the fact that he was kidnapped and almost killed from everyone, especially MM. And as for the second point, Frenchie's subplot, starting from him talking with Shuri to ending with him escaping Nina and her goons, goes through 5 episodes. And let's be honest, without Frenchie's subplot, Season 3's main plot isn't affected in the slightest. The only thing you can say has some effect is Kimiko's motivation to get her powers back due to the near-death ordeal, which helps her protect Frenchie as he makes a new batch of Novikov to drug Soldier Boy. But the writers could have easily made Kimiko want her powers back for any other reason. For example, after losing her powers and getting sent flying through a concrete wall, the hospital tells the boys there's a high chance she won't survive, so they decide to get Compound V to save her life. Kimiko is, at first, against it and content with dying because she's free from her powers that she believes makes her a monster. But in the end, she decides to take it because she's reminded how much Frenchie loves her and needs her, and what Frenchie told her before they did the job for little Nina.
Maybe it's time we leave. Really? So we do this job, and then where do you want to go? Huh? We go to Marseille. Oh.
And from there, the rest of the season plays out the same. Even if you didn't like my replacement example, it should show you how disconnected Frenchie's subplot is from the rest of the season. Finishing up on my issues with Frenchie's subplot, I mentioned earlier I talk more about Kimiko's role near the end of his side story, and that's because it has to do with my next problem with this season: Starlight. Specifically, how she never gets called out for certain actions she takes throughout the season, like her behavior towards Huey for starters. Throughout the season, Starlight and Huey's relationship goes through serious hardships once she finds out Huey's been secretly plotting with the boys to find a weapon to kill Homelander, ultimately being Soldier Boy, without her knowledge. And Huey's been taking a substance introduced this season known as V24, or Temp V, a chemical that gives normal people superpowers for 24 hours. All Starlight knows about Soldier Boy is he's the one who killed tons of innocents in New York City, so she's, understandably, not very trusting of this guy, and angry Huey would hide the fact he's working with someone like him. And as for the Temp V, she's concerned with Huey's behavior while on it, worried that it could be affecting his mental state. However, this isn't the problem I have with her, this is just the lead up to it. In episode 6's Herogasm, after Huey teleports her away from the TNT Twins' house, she's had enough of Huey keeping secrets from her. In their argument, Huey finally reveals why he takes the Temp V.
Right, God forbid I help you because I always have to be the weak one. The one you have to rescue. You always have to be the strong one. You always have to be so much stronger than me.
He hates feeling powerless and not being able to protect her. She calls him out for what he said back in season 1.
I thought that you didn't care about that. I mean, on our first date, you said that it didn't bother you.
You say you bowled a lot, and, you know, you have, like, superpowers, yet you are a remarkably shitty bowler. I think you're holding back for some weird, not gonna show me up on a first date reason. You wanna quit stroking my ego and show me what you really got?
But he admits he really does care about her being powerful and him being weak. Their argument over this was a very powerful scene. However, the issue never gets a proper resolution. All that happens is, in the last episode of this season, Butcher stops Huey from taking more Temp V shots by knocking him out after Starlight warns Butcher it's fatal to take a certain number of doses. Then when Huey calls her for a ride and essentially says he was in the wrong,
Annie, I'm so sorry. I've been an asshole. I never should have. I never should have put any of this onto you.
Oh my God! I fucking told you so.
that seems to be the end of their issues as far as the show is concerned. But from the viewer's perspective, it doesn't make much sense. 2 episodes ago, she was disappointed in Huey because he hated how weak he was needing to rely on her for help and not being able to protect her. But for some reason, Starlight doesn't consider things from his perspective. For one, even before the events of this show, Huey's always been weak and bullied throughout his childhood, possibly stemming from his mother abandoning him at a young age. Throughout the show, almost every character, including his team, has threatened him, bullied him, pushed him around, emasculated him, and assaulted him.
Fuck you, you fucking crazy! Man.
Even his father practically told Huey as far back as the first episode of this show that cowardice runs in their family when he urged Huey to sign Vought's NDA contract over the death of his longtime girlfriend in exchange for a payout.
Be realistic, okay? Even if we could pay for a lawyer, and that's a big if, there's no case.
Dad, she was one step off the curb.
Huey, look,
I saw
look.
it.
You can't do this.
Why not, Dad? I have.
You don't have the fight. You never have. I'm sorry, but it's true. Neither do I. Now, come and sit with me, okay? Remington Steele's on.
Huey, where are you going?
His father, being an emotionally weak man himself, clearly shows the viewer where Huey got his behavior from. Meanwhile, Huey rarely fights back against those who put him down, nor do any of his friends ever stand up for him.
This is the guy? He's even more of a twink than in the photo. I could split that shit like dry firewood.
I need to ask you something.
Hey, Maeve. Good to see you again. Glad you're okay.
It's like you wear a neon sign that says, raw dog meat, I'm a bottom.
I'm gonna let you two catch up.
Me too.
In fact, the only time I can think of where someone stands up for Huey in response to direct danger is when Soldier Boy punched Huey and Butcher immediately threatened to laser Soldier Boy to make him back off. Which leads to my next point about Huey that Starlight doesn't acknowledge from his perspective. He's not a soup. Huey is a normal man living in a world surrounded by people with superpowers. All of his enemies are soups who are backed by Vought, a powerful corporation with its hands in the government and the media. So he has to live with the reality that they could kill him whenever they want, essentially get away with it by avoiding legal consequences, and utilize the media to fool people with any story they make up about Huey's death. And this isn't some hypothetical conspiracy theory. Vought has done that very thing countless times throughout the show.
Tragically relapsed into an opioid addiction, just as he was slated to join the Seven.
And finally, him losing Robin is something that still greatly haunts him. In the span of a split second, Huey lost his longtime girlfriend and soon-to-be fiancé to an uncaring soup who was high off Compound V. He was unable to protect her, watched her body get obliterated to pieces while still holding onto her detached hands, and was made to sign a contract by Vought to forget all about it for some money. So when he finally moved on with Starlight by the end of season 1, his newfound obsession to be protective didn't go away just because she's a soup herself. Huey using Temp V evens the scales tremendously and temporarily puts his inferiority complex to rest. For starters, he doesn't feel like a burden to Starlight to be constantly protected when now he's able to protect himself too. Starlight is a soup, but she's not a god. What'll happen if a soup more powerful than her decides to go after Huey? She'll be powerless to stop the threat, or just get herself beaten or killed, leaving Huey a sitting duck. For example, in Season 3, she came up with a plan to convince members of the Seven to help stand up against Homelander when the boys finally find the soup gun. But it backfired severely when A-Train learned of the plan from Supersonic and ratted them all out to Homelander. In response, Homelander brutally murdered Supersonic and warned Starlight if she acts out again, he'll kill Huey next. What if instead of warning her, he straight up told her he's gonna kill Huey right now and flew off? What exactly could she do to save him? She can't fly, her powers won't hurt him, and by the time she reaches Huey on the phone, Homelander would already be at least 3/4 of the way to Huey's house before she has the chance to say a single word over the phone. Secondly, the Temp V allows him to protect those close to him, so he'll never be helpless and have to see a loved one suffer the fate Robin did ever again. Starlight has shown herself to be the weakest soup in the boys' team. Throughout the whole show, she's lost every fight she had against another soup one-on-one. The only time she did win were either because she was saved at the last minute by someone else, or because she had other soups from the start to help her jump one person. She almost died fighting Black Noir one-on-one, and the only power he has is durability. The rest is just him fighting using knives and hand-to-hand combat. He can't use guns on her since she's resistant to bullets, so he has to get up close to kill her. So even though Noir did get the jump on her, she still has range on her side. She's also in a room filled with lights and other electrical appliances, the very thing she needs for her powers to work. So she has a constant source of electricity to shoot continuous blasts of light at Noir to keep him physically away from her. Yet despite all the advantages, she still nearly died to him. Homelander is significantly more powerful than Noir, so I don't think I need to explain how well Starlight would do fighting against him. And while we're on the topic of her powers, in her fight against Soldier Boy, Huey took advantage of Vought's control room to give more electricity to the TV studio the fight took place in to give Starlight a massive power boost. It gave her so much power she was able to slowly levitate in the air for a bit. But when she let it all out in a massive blast at Soldier Boy, all it did was give him a simple push to the floor. He got back up a second later, and if it wasn't for Kimiko, another soup, quickly taking the opportunity to help restrain him, and MM using the gas mask filled with Novikov, Soldier Boy would have been ready to keep fighting everyone. Now, I'm not pointing all this out to trash on Starlight's character. I actually like her, and you don't need to make a character super powerful and good at everything to be likable. There's also nothing wrong with having protection of your own or some extra backup. Huey shares similar flaws, yet viewers love him. My problem with Starlight this season is despite her flaws, the show's writers never compel her to change or improve. Like with Supersonic. After he died and Maeve got kidnapped due to her plan getting leaked, instead of laying low or coming up with a different plan, she tries the same plan again, this time dragging Ashley into it. Starlight's so selfish at this point. It's almost comical that right after getting her friend killed, she tries to drag more innocence into this, and she comes off completely oblivious and surprised as to why Ashley, the normal human with no superpowers or protection of any kind against Homelander and stands to lose everything, wants no part in Starlight's scheme. And while we're on this point, Starlight had such a big issue with Maeve and Butcher's plan to use Soldier Boy, yet she never offers any alternative ideas. She just complains about it all season long and tries to stop them, yet for some strange reason, no one ever stopped and asked her the simple question, what do you think we should do instead? I would have loved to hear her answer to that, because she was pretty quiet on that front. In fact, before she knew the soup gun was Soldier Boy, her only plan was to get the Seven members to help fight Homelander when the boys find the soup gun. Her plan was basically to rely on another person's plan.
Annie, listen. We wanted a weapon. Soldier Boy's our weapon. He's how we kill Homelander, and Newman, maybe. If anyone's strong enough, he is.
Huey, you're teaming up with a murderer.
But let's say Starlight had everything go her way. Huey stopped using Temp V as far back as episode 3, And in the last episode, Starlight, with the help of MM, Frenchie, and Kimiko, managed to subdue Soldier Boy before going to Vought Tower. Well, congrats Starlight, you did it! You destroyed your only chance against Homelander! Now what? By the end of the season, Homelander has gone off the deep end. He just killed Black Noir, and he's thirsty for more blood. If Maeve and the boys don't show up to Vought Tower, I'm sure Homelander would go to them instead. And if he did, it'd be game over for all of them. Without setting a foot in the boys' headquarters, Homelander could easily just laser them all from outside. Huey, MM, and Frenchie have no powers at this point, so they're dead. Kimiko would die and come back to life, but while she's slowly healing, that leaves Starlight, Soup Butcher, and Maeve as the only ones left to fight. Starlight's free to pull out her phone and record Homelander live again, but I don't think her Instagram followers are going to be much help this time around. Besides, outside of that recording trick she pulled on him the first time, Starlight usually gets as frozen as a deer in traffic whenever Homelander does as much as scowl at her. So really, it's just Maeve and Butcher left, after Homelander quickly insta-kills Starlight by hand if his lasers aren't strong enough. Soup Butcher can fight, but he's not lasting long against a guy who's had the same powers as him, plus more, all his life. We've seen as much in the Herogasm episode. And lastly, for Maeve, we know Homelander won't kill her since he has more sinister plans for her, based on what he told her in episode 7.
I would never force myself on you. But I am gonna harvest your eggs.
I think this grim, but realistic hypothetical should have thoroughly explained to any detractors watching this video of the fatal end Starlight's extreme naivete and complete lack of alternative solutions could have brought to herself and her friends had Butcher, Huey, and Maeve let her stop them without any pushback. In addition, when she finds herself in dangerous situations, she never tells Huey about them and keeps it all to herself. Like when Victoria Newman revealed she knows that they know she's a head-popping soup, and that she threatened Starlight by almost blowing her head up because she refused to do any shady work with her. Ironic, because the fight between Huey and Starlight started because she didn't like Huey hiding dangerous things from her, like him working with Soldier Boy. And I guarantee the writers had to have known this too. After all, both Victoria's threat and Starlight and Huey's big fight at Herogasm happened in the same episode, in that order. So why didn't Starlight tell Huey about Victoria after she was threatened? The only thing I can guess is the writers thought they'd write themselves into a corner trying to make Starlight look like she won the argument, because Huey could easily bring that up in their fight as a way to validate him wanting to protect her with his powers. After all, with him being able to teleport, Huey could easily kill Newman whenever he wants by teleporting behind her by surprise, grabbing her, teleporting with her to the top of a volcano, or the middle of Antarctica, or the top of an oxygen-deprived mountain, or wherever, and quickly teleport himself back to safety. And speaking of teleporting, Huey also saved Starlight by teleporting themselves far away from Herogasm. Had she still been in the house, she most likely would have died when Soldier Boy blew up the house with his super-moving blast. But then again, right before Huey teleported her, she was about to confront Soldier Boy. I'm sure that's what some of you are thinking. But remember, based on how powerful he is, and her record of losing in fights against Soup's leagues weaker than him, he could easily take care of her if they fought. Just look at how well she did against him 2 episodes later. Even if Huey didn't know about Starlight's encounter with Newman, he still had a counterpoint in the argument: his PTSD. All he had to say was this:
I thought the drugs had fucked you up, Huey, but this is you.
My last girlfriend turned into red goop and liquefied bones in front of my face, and I was completely powerless to stop it. No matter how much therapy I do, that image of me holding onto her locked off hands will stay in my mind for the rest of my life. I try to do things the right way, go through all the legal channels and everything, but I got shut down by Vought super lawyers before I even had the fucking chance. Annie, I couldn't even avenge her. If it wasn't for Butcher coming up to me that day, getting me into this life, I would have signed to Annie. My dad was pushing me to sign Vaught's NDA for their hush money, and I would have done it, because he said we needed the cash. That's how weak I was, Annie, and I never wanted to feel that way again. But after finding out Victoria's organization to keep Soups in check was all a scam, and Homelander threatened you in the dressing room, those feelings came back. I tried to do things the quote-unquote right way again, and look how that worked out. So you want to know why I can't let go of the V? Because I already lost someone I loved to a Soup so fucked in the head, I still have nightmares about it. And I don't need a part 2.
Don't get me wrong, I'm well aware Huey's not completely innocent. Him working with Soulja Boy to hunt down all the members of his old team puts the lives of innocents at risk if they're unknowingly in his way. And Huey's clear addiction to Temp V was planting the seeds of a power complex in him. If it weren't for the fatal side effects and Starlight trying to stop him, his personality could end up as corrupted as Soups like Homelander, or, ironically, like A-Train, with Huey thinking he can do whatever he wants with little care about those getting harmed around him. We did see a bit of that after he used his powers for the first time, and he was in a state of lucidity, completely uncaring towards Kimiko, who was in a near-death state just a few feet away from him. But here's the thing, the show already calls Huey out for all the things I just mentioned, whereas the same can't be said for Starlight. And, after doing some research for this video, I'm happy to see I'm not alone in this opinion either. Just go to any YouTube video of the fight Huey and Starlight had during the Herogasm episode, or Twitter thread or Reddit thread talking about it. Scroll through the comment section, and you'll see tons of people echoing the same grievances I had with both this scene and how their relationship was handled throughout this season. Another grievance I've had that everyone has pointed out is a pretty damning one: Starlight's hypocrisy. She was appalled Huey wanted to keep using Temp V so he could protect her, yet in the very next episode, Kimiko asks Starlight for help to steal Compound V from Vought so she could protect the one she loves, Frenchie, and Starlight agrees to do it. Remember when I said I'd talk more about Kimiko's role at the end of Frenchie's subplot later on? Well, here we are. Now at first, I thought this would lead to Starlight understanding where Huey was coming from when she's forced to see someone else go through the same situation he did, and that Huey and Starlight would come to understand each other better by the end of the season, strengthening their relationship in the process. But instead of that, Starlight helps Kimiko do the very thing Huey was trying to do, which is to get powers, all without any sense of self-awareness or reflection on her own situation with Huey. And when she's done helping Kimiko steal Compound V, she, once again, doesn't tell Huey what she's been up to at Vought Tower. Probably because if she did, like her encounter with Newman, Huey would, rightfully, call her out for her hypocrisy. So why did the writers work so hard to make Huey look like such a bad guy? They unknowingly made Starlight a massive hypocrite by doing this. And to be transparent, I know MM's also a hypocrite in the same way. He hated Huey followed in Butcher's footsteps in taking Temp V, and even thought about killing Huey and Butcher a few episodes later.
I think Soulja Boy is bulletproof.
This ain't for Soulja Boy.
I'm pissed at those guys too, but we have to keep our heads on.
Why? Why do I always have to take the high road? Fuck the high road, fuck Butcher, and fuck Huey.
Huey is not himself right now.
Huey is a grown-ass man that's made his own choices.
MM! Please!
But if Huey never took Temp V, MM wouldn't be alive right now to say all this. Instead, he'd be lying dead in a Russian facility. And Huey never called MM out either whenever he criticized them using Temp V.
You're better than this, kid.
Butcher, look, I'm sorry, okay? It's just,
But these two characters rarely interact with each other this season, so outside of that, unfortunately there's nothing else substantial for me to say other than acknowledging it's there. In fact, in just 2 sentences, I detailed all the direct interactions they have with each other in all of Season 3. So with that out of the way, let's get back to my original point about the hypocrisy the show has towards how they treat Starlight versus how they treat Huey. I did a little research into this and found something pretty interesting. Turns out, the double standards between Huey's and Kimiko's character arcs were talked about on Twitter, and it caught the attention of the showrunner, Eric Kripke. And what he had to say was interesting. At the very least, it immediately explained why Huey was written to look so bad and Starlight so virtuous, despite evidence present throughout the season proving otherwise. When a Twitter user questioned Starlight's double standard of being against Huey wanting powers to protect her, yet helps Kimiko get her powers back so she can protect Frenchie, Kripke said, and I quote, because Huey's craving was selfish to make himself feel macho and save a woman who doesn't want saving. Kimiko's is a selfless sacrifice that's a burden to her, to protect the man who welcomes the protection. Big difference. End quote. Now, I only wanted to just talk about the show and not bring real-world politics into this video, so I'll keep this to a minimum. But let's be real here. Everyone who both agreed and disagreed with Kripke's post were able to read between the lines. This was his way of insinuating Huey's actions were an example of toxic masculinity. And if you couldn't see that, he made it crystal clear in this interview with Insider. Honestly, ever since the day I made the mistake of making a Twitter account, I've seen many screenwriters, showrunners, artists, and more in a new light when seeing their personal opinions, particularly regarding how they portray and speak about men as a collective. When expressing negative opinions, some tend to use indirect language and roundabout wording. It happens so often with these people, you can easily see right through it. Which is why, as I said earlier, people who both agreed and disagreed with Kripke knew what he was really trying to say about Huey. So now that we've clearly established Kripke's statement and belief on why he wrote Huey that way this season, here's what I have to say about it. It was a very weak response. Nonsensical too, if you take the time to think about what he said. To start with, I agree Huey had a selfish craving, but not for the reason Kripke's claiming. I'll reiterate what I said a while ago. Throughout the whole show, including before the events of this show, Huey's been pushed around, bullied, threatened, and more by almost everyone around him. Imagine you living a life like that in the real world. In fact, I'm sure a good chunk of you watching this video are currently living that life and don't have to imagine it. Now imagine you have a longtime girlfriend or boyfriend killed right in front of you due to a senseless act of violence committed by a celebrity drug addict off a high, and you're the only one who seems to care about getting justice for your dead partner. But now, you have access to a practically supernatural power. Wouldn't you use it to A. Make people stop pushing you around and treat you with basic respect, B. Get revenge on the person who killed your soon-to-be fiancé and got away with it scot-free, and C. Use it to protect your loved ones who are still alive so you'll never go through that trauma again? Many people would publicly claim they'd never do such a thing, yet privately have that idea in the back of their minds. Huey is an example of exactly that. Ever since he got his powers, people like Butcher stopped putting him down like he did in previous seasons. Homelander got a bit of a run for his money when he got surprised at how strong Huey was for being able to shove him off Butcher and fast enough to dodge his lasers. A-Train got a well-deserved punch in the face for killing Huey's first girlfriend, further making A-Train empathetic for people other than his brother for the first time in the show, and fully understand the result of the chaos and hurt he's brought to innocent people. And Huey saved Starlight from getting herself insta-killed by Soldier Boy by teleporting her away from the TNT Twins' house. Eric Kripke put all this payoff for an underdog character who was being built up in previous seasons, but then turns around and calls him selfish, wanting to be macho, and a case of toxic masculinity? He even doubled down in that Insider interview, saying toxic masculinity is something Huey finds seductive but ultimately empty. Apparently as seductive as, in Kripke's words, being the kid who has sand kicked in your face and then you get to punch back and feel like you're in an action movie, but it's all really empty and destructive. So according to Kripke's analogy, he's obviously comparing Huey to the kid who punched the other kid for kicking sand in his face. Funnily enough, Kripke says nothing about the kid who started the altercation by kicking sand in another kid's face, but calls the boy who retaliates against someone actively assaulting them the one exhibiting toxic masculinity, the one wanting to feel like being in an action movie, and the one engaging in empty and destructive behavior. In that same analogy, many of the soups can be compared to the kid who's kicking the sand, like A-Train when he killed Huey's soon-to-be fiancé, laughed about it later in a club, never faced any justice thanks to super lawyers backing him, randomly blaming Huey for everything bad he brought in his own life, and never feeling any remorse about it for years until he had a similar fate come to his loved one. He's not the toxic male in this according to Kripke, but Huey is, because he punched him in the face that one time? Or how about Maeve? She also fits the analogy as being the kid who kicks the sand. She apparently has an intense hatred for Huey. It's never explained why she does either. And no, it's not because he killed Translucent, a guy she didn't like anyways. or waged a war between the boys and the Seven, Butcher, and Frenchie all played larger parts in that. Yet she never shows that same animosity towards any of them. Instead, every time she's around Huey, she has the sudden urge to say things like this.
Good to see you again. Glad you're okay.
It's like you wear a neon sign that says, raw dog meat, I'm a bottom.
I'm gonna let you two catch up.
Me too.
Hey, Huey.
He's even more of a twink than in the photo.
And sooner or later, they're gonna hurt someone you love.
Am I talking to you?
Take your fucking twink and get the fuck out of here!
For those who don't know what that word means, in basic terms, it's a word used to describe a naturally effeminate-looking man. When using it to describe a man, it also carries the connotation that they're a homosexual. Maeve is clearly using the term as an insult and a way to emasculate Huey since he's straight. Yet, every time she talks like this about him, the scene is played for laughs. Again, according to Kripke's analogy about the kid kicking sand in another kid's face, Maeve is the kid kicking the sand. Therefore, she's not the toxic one. And since Huey stands there in both instances and quietly takes the derogatory remarks, I'm sure in Kripke's eyes, that's him being secure in his masculinity. Because if he did speak up for himself to tell Maeve to give him basic respect, that would automatically make him the toxic one, since he would become the kid who punches the sand kicker from the analogy. Kripke's twisted metaphor shows his outlook on life and human nature as clear as day. And that sort of outlook is the exact reason why bullies, harassers, and other types of malicious people get away with victimizing others with nothing more than a slap on their wrist, while their victims get severely punished by authority figures the nanosecond they stand up for themselves. With all that said, surely I don't need to explain any further how all the trauma Huey suffered, and is working hard to prevent from happening in his life again, should never be considered toxic masculinity, as anyone would do what he did regardless of their gender. Because if it is toxic, why do the show's writers and fans alike either ignore or praise female characters, like Starlight and Kimiko, for expressing the same behavior? Do Kripke and his agreeing fans consider the act of protecting someone toxic, or the gender of the person performing the action? Quick PSA to you, the viewers, if you personally know anyone in your life who thinks that way, especially if it's a man, it's in your best interest to avoid having any sort of relationship with them, friendship or otherwise. These are the types of people who would sit back and quietly abandon you in a time of need because they're more concerned about how potentially toxic they'll look if they help you than actually helping you. And while we're at it, Huey made similar remarks to Starlight that he doesn't want to be saved by her either.
God forbid I help you because I always have to be the weak one. The one you have to rescue.
Yet for some reason, Kripke and those who agreed with his Twitter post aren't calling Starlight selfish for wanting to save a man who doesn't want protection. I'd imagine they claim Huey is a misogynist because he doesn't want to be saved by a woman, yet at the same time respect Starlight for not wanting a man to save her. And if you think it's egregious of me to say that, just remember, these people, including Kripke, went out of their way to bring up and put emphasis on these characters' genders when answering a simple question about one character's action, and doubled down on it later on in an interview. I want to address another thing about the Huey feeling macho wanting to save a woman who doesn't want saving part. Again, I don't want this video to delve too much into politics like this, but when those in charge of creating modern media keep low-key injecting these weird topics into their plots, I have to discuss it if I'm going to talk about said plot. Notice Kripke said Starlight doesn't want saving. What people want and need are two different things. Kids, for example, want to eat junk food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but they need to eat healthy. And before anyone disingenuous tries it, I'm not calling Starlight a kid. It's just a simple analogy I made that doesn't involve sand kicking or seduction of toxic masculinity to ease you into the point I'm about to make. Starlight may not want saving, but she has definitely needed it. Throughout the whole show, she's been sexually assaulted, physically assaulted, punked, threatened, and nearly killed by Soups. And before she met Huey, rarely anyone in her circle came to her rescue or even cared about her. I mean, her own parents don't really love her. Her mother turned her into a Soup, got her into disturbing things like child beauty pageants and more, all because she wants to live her dreams of being a celebrity through her daughter.
I gave up every moment of my life. And I was happy to do it. This was our dream.
This was your dream. I never got a chance to choose my own dreams. No wonder I don't know who the fuck I'm supposed to be. Annie.
Her dad had second thoughts and got uncomfortable with giving baby Annie Compound V, but when he learned his wife had Vought do the procedure behind his back, he decided to run off and abandon the family, leaving Annie to be raised by a toxic, narcissist mother. Thanks to her now deadbeat husband's absence, Annie's mom easily took advantage of the situation to spin the narrative and lie to her daughter of the true reason why he left. Because if she told the truth, she'd also have to admit she lied about where Annie's powers came from. Not from being chosen by God, but from a twisted organization her parents voluntarily offered her up to as a child sacrifice to conduct their science experiments on.
You told me that Daddy left because he lost all of our savings.
He agreed to all of it. And then one day he didn't. So he walked out on us.
Maybe he didn't want to lie to me.
So I'm the monster. You have a good life. People would give anything to be what you are.
Fast forward to present day. By the time she had been saved by someone, most of the time the deed was already done to her. For example, Maeve stood up for Annie when Homelander threatened her life, accusing her of being a mole trying to take down the Seven. However, Maeve only did so after being convinced by Starlight in previous scenes into being empathetic for others. Because before this, she didn't care much about Starlight after learning she was sexually assaulted by the Deep. Instead, she told Starlight, in an annoyed tone, to basically suck it up, to not risk the public seeing them all in a bad light.
Oh, for Christ's sakes. Clean yourself up. Never let them see you like this.
All while Maeve was fully aware Translucent was creepily watching them both in the women's restroom using his invisibility powers.
Translucent, you're a goddamn pervert.
I'll just go.
So you can clearly see how it's a little hard to trust Starlight when she says this to Huey.
But I don't need you to save me.
Or when Eric Kripke says this on Twitter, while his own show has been saying the exact opposite since the first episode. Now, if this was about Huey being overprotective, that's a different story. I would have loved to see Huey go through an arc like that instead of this macho whatever nonsense Kripke's going on about. I even gave a hypothetical scene earlier in this video that was super well acted, super emotional, and I felt was a better way to progress Huey and Starlight's relationship. All in all, as long as Huey's protection over Starlight doesn't come at the cost of her independence and freedom, there shouldn't be an issue here. Just like how the show had no issue with Kimiko doing the same for Frenchie, and Starlight ironically doing the same for Huey. Interestingly, I should also mention that Jack Quaid, the actor who plays Huey in the show, fully agreed with Kripke's Twitter post. And as far as we know, he's the only actor from the show who publicly put his 2 cents into this. Fortunately for both Quaid and Kripke, a good number of people were kind enough to quickly and thoroughly correct them in the replies with the same points I talked about here. So hopefully with this sort of pushback, we might not see narrative issues like this again in Season 4. Might. The next issue I had with this season is the nonsensical plot armor on some characters, and the hesitancy from writers to kill them off when the narrative requires it. The biggest example of this is A-Train's death scene near the end of the Herogasm episode. Yes, we're still not done bringing up that episode. His character arc was complete, and it should have ended with him dying after killing Blue Hawk. But before I go on, let's recap his arc from the beginning as a quick refresher. Since the last 2 seasons, A-Train's had a drug abuse problem with Compound V, taking it at first to give him a leg up in races, basically a glorified steroid for soups. It soon led to an addiction. That addiction gave him heart issues, and doctors warned him if he ran again, he'd die of a heart attack. The whole show, A-Train was a narcissist, and you can argue borderline sociopath too, who'd do whatever it took to propel himself forward in life, no matter who got hurt in the process. He cheated in races by abusing Compound V, and would constantly betray and rat people out to Homelander for the man's approval. A-Train sees him as the most powerful man on Earth, so despite Homelander constantly looking down on him, especially more so since he can't use his powers anymore, making him dead weight to the team, it makes sense A-Train would do anything to be damn near considered Homelander's right-hand man. This would all come to a head when his low-effort antics to appeal to the black community involved bringing a notorious soup, Blue Hawk, to the local community center, resulting in his brother getting seriously injured by him in the crossfire, and doctors telling A-Train his brother will now be crippled for the rest of his life. A-Train reports to Ashley about Blue Hawk and is shocked to hear the only punishment she gave him was a few months of sensitivity training. A-Train demands proper justice in the form of charges and legal prosecution. He berates Ashley more and more to get him justice for his brother, until she snaps and calls him out for his hypocrisy. She rightfully points out all the murders he's done and how she and Vought had to clean up after him when the victims of his actions were looking for the same justice he's looking for now. She finishes off by cursing him out for everything he put her through. At this moment, A-Train finally got the realization us viewers have been waiting for since season 1. He's forced to suffer the same way the victims of his antics did. He's forced to open his eyes to how Vought operates, with how controversies like the Deep, the public learning about Compound V's existence, Stormfront's background, and more have affected Vaught's public image, finances, and legal standing. It's easy to see why they worked as hard as they did to sweep all soup-related issues under the rug since their inception. And with that clarity, A-Train now realizes he's forced to be on the receiving end of the very same immunity from legal and social repercussions he's always enjoyed and abused himself. Because if Vought were actually as virtuous as he wants them to be with Blue Hawk, A-Train himself would have been in prison years ago for murdering Huey's girlfriend while high on Compound V. And in a twisted, ironic way, had A-Train been punished with prison time, his brother would never be wheelchair-bound, because A-Train wouldn't be around to bring Blue Hawk to the community center that day in the first place. Looks like when A-Train went on his deluded rant back in the first season, blaming Huey for things he was actually guilty of, A-Train was projecting even more than we thought.
How does this not all start with you, Huey?
Later on at Herogasm, he gets confronted by Soup Huey over Robin's death, and instead of giving a narcissistic response like always, he finally feels true remorse and apologizes to Huey for what he did. And although he truly did mean his apology, A-Train learned a hard fact of life. Saying sorry doesn't always fix a situation, especially one that involved committing a senseless murder, bragging about the murder, and giving obviously insincere apologies for years on end. In a case like this, it's not surprising that a victim like Huey believes violence against his perpetrator is the only answer to the pain he's still suffering. So when A-Train finally finds Blue Hawk, he decides to kill him using his powers, all while knowing he'll die of a heart attack by doing so. With a dead Blue Hawk and A-Train now succumbing to a heart attack, despite the pain and fear of his demise coming closer and closer, he can die content, knowing he's avenged his brother, he's avenged various black communities for the chaos Blue Hawk has caused, and atoned for all victims of the crimes and destruction A-Train's brought to their lives. Before this scene, viewers hated A-Train for his behavior, especially his recent antics like snitching to Homelander about Starlight's plan and bringing Blue Hawk to the community center to wreak havoc. But now, when he's seconds from dying, we saw him in a tragic light. We empathized with him. All of a sudden, we didn't want him to die. In fact, most viewers were even shocked seeing him go out like this. And the reason why our emotions towards him changed is because in his last moments, he finally changed for the better. He finally redeemed himself, wrapping up his character arc and achieving what us viewers wanted for him since the start of the show. And then the very next episode came out and reversed everything I just said by turning his death into a fake out. He wakes up in a hospital, with Ashley telling him they revived him and gave him Blue Hawk's heart, so he'll finally be able to run again. Okay. First, I want to know how this hospital scene was even possible in the first place. A-Train had a heart attack and collapsed in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any city or town. How did Vought get both him and Blue Hawk to an operating table and transplant Blue Hawk's heart in time before A-Train died? There were no vehicles, planes, or helicopters we could hear or see nearby. Once his heart stopped beating, his organs would soon stop functioning because there's no blood being pumped through them. He'd only have seconds to live. In fact, the amount of time the camera took to zoom out from A-Train's face as he was lying on the ground was long enough to consider him beyond resuscitation. At best, he'd be brain dead if they tried at this point. Does Vought secretly have another speedster soup in their roster who's also a cardio surgeon? The only soup we know of who can move that fast and is still alive at this point in the show is Homelander. But Homelander doesn't care about A-Train. He's made it very clear since season 2 he sees A-Train as dead weight to the team, and A-Train being Homelander's personal snitch informant will never change that. Even if he randomly cared about A-Train at this precise moment, he couldn't save him anyways because he was in the middle of confronting Soldier Boy and Butcher at the same time. Which now leads to my next question. How did Vought know A-Train was dying? The only thing we know of Vought when it comes to keeping track of their soups is that Vought implants tracking devices in all their bodies that'll provide their exact GPS location. We've seen this introduced in season 1, where the boys kidnap Translucent, and Huey explains to Frenchie why the specific tinfoil they're using to cover the walls and ceilings of the room they put him in will block the tracking chip signal from reaching Vought. However, the tracking chip does just that. Tracking. It doesn't monitor their heart rate or health status. If it did, then Vought would have thought Starlight was dead when she removed her tracking chip back in season 2. And some viewers watching this might argue that the writers didn't think that far ahead back then, so Vought knowing A-Train had a heart attack due to the tracking chip is their way of retconning how they work. However, Black Noir removed his tracking chip in an earlier episode of season 3, yet Homelander, Ashley, and the Deep didn't think he was dead either. But let's ignore all that and pretend there's a perfectly logical way Vought knew A-Train was suffering from a heart attack and got him and Blue Hawk on an operating table within seconds to do the heart transplant. Let's also ignore how super convenient it is that A-Train and Blue Hawk's blood types match perfectly to do the operation. Either that or A-Train's an AB positive. Look, either way doesn't matter. My last question is this. How does Blue Hawk's heart work for A-Train? Yes, they're both soups, but A-Train's original heart works differently than his. Since he has the power to run super fast, his heart needs to beat as fast to pump enough blood throughout his body. Last I checked, Blue Hawk's only power we've seen is super strength, which doesn't mean much since all soups have some level of super strength. So, wouldn't Blue Hawk's heart give out from stress if A-Train runs too fast for too long? Unfortunately, the show never answers any of these questions and just skirts by these gaping plot holes. So I have no choice but to do the same and get on with the next thing I don't like about A-Train's revival. Essentially, it's a waste. Narratively, it makes no sense to go down this route because it cheapens the initial impact of A-Train's supposed death and ruins a good end to his character arc. The writers just wrote themselves in a corner by undoing his death. Now the question comes, what's left to do with this character? It's clear the writers don't have an answer since they just have him meandering around for the most part. The only significant thing that happens with him afterwards is A-Train confessing to his brother he killed Blue Hawk. Once again, had A-Train actually died, this plot point would have played out much stronger narrative-wise. How would his older brother Nate react to the news of Blue Hawk's and A-Train's deaths? Naturally, Vought would cover up the full truth behind it, but would Nate be intuitive enough to put 2 and 2 together? Whether he does or not, how would he move forward in his life after permanently losing his ability to walk, and now his younger brother, in the span of a week? His brother, a soup who he and his family put a lot of faith and commitment in to use his powers to get them all out of poverty, which A-Train succeeded in by getting inducted in the Seven. Basically the success story many first-generation citizens in America wish to achieve in their own lives for their immigrant families. Would Nathan be able to come to terms with this new reality, or have a complete mental breakdown? This was the writers' chance to flesh out a supporting character we don't know much about, other than being A-Train's brother and trainer, to see how he'd react when A-Train isn't around to respond to anything he thinks or says about the whole situation. Instead, we got this underwhelming scenario in comparison. A-Train essentially gets disowned by his brother for 2 reasons. One, because A-Train killed Blue Hawk, which is strange. I guess his brother never knew about any of the other murders he's committed, even though Robin's death was all over the news. Granted, Vought lied about the circumstances to save A-Train's image, but still. Getting back on topic, the second reason Nate disowned him is, Nate foolishly believed the police would arrest a soup and make them face justice for committing crimes. All this is clearly the show's way of putting A-Train on a path to redeem himself. Again. Essentially resetting his character arc. Again. The show so far has been pretty competent with killing off characters at the best moments possible that would have viewers at the edge of their seats for better and worse. So it honestly had me scratching my head trying to figure out why they wasted a perfectly good death scene and send-off to the character. That was, until a few months after the season ended, I saw a trailer for an upcoming spin-off of The Boys called Gen V, and in it, you can clearly see A-Train, along with other returning characters, Ashley and Adam. If you don't remember, he's the director of that fictional movie about the Seven, along with The Deep being announced to return according to articles leading up to the show's premiere. And then it all made sense. Now, this is just speculation on my part, but follow along with me here. I think the writers wanted to kill off A-Train after he killed Blue Hawk, but down the line in production, either they or their higher-ups pitched an idea for a spin-off while The Boys' popularity was still at its peak for more profit. Making spin-offs of any popular media in general is riskier than you think. Although they're usually made by the same people, they don't always retain the same audience who are into the main show, video game, or etc. it's based on. For example, Buffy the Vampire Slayer was an extremely popular show running throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, but when its spin-off show Angel started, despite the show centering on a character who featured prominently in the main show, it still had countless cameos and crossover episodes with the main show to keep Buffy fans invested in the spin-off. And when Angel managed to build a large enough fan base, it slowed down on the amount of crossover episodes and focused more on being its own thing and fleshing out the show's original characters. I suspect that's what Kripke and his crew are trying to do here with the Gen V spin-off show. That's why they rewrote A-Train's death scene and kept him alive. I doubt they're even going to do much with him in season 4 of the main show. This was just so they have more star power in Gen V so more fans of The Boys will watch it. Again, this is all speculation on my part, so the truth behind A-Train's sudden Deus Ex Machina could be a completely different story. Now let's talk about another character's death that should have been. Queen Maeve. I can confidently say there's nothing left for her character to do in the show. She lost her powers at the end of season 3, which is something she's always wanted for years, and since Homelander thinks she's dead, thanks to Ashley deleting video evidence of her surviving the fall, she intends to lay low with Elena and live a happy life, free from Vought, and especially Homelander. So I doubt they kept her alive to appear in the Gen V show. In the last episode of season 3, she sacrificed herself by tackling Soldier Boy out of a window right before he exploded his soup-draining radiation powers in order to save Starlight, Ryan, and the boys. Throughout this season, the show's established how Soldier Boy's soup-draining powers work. Any soup exposed to his blast loses their powers permanently. Continued exposure to his blast, including anyone who's not a soup, results in getting instantly vaporized. For the most part, the show has followed this rule. For the most part. But the most egregious part of the show where you can't ignore they broke that rule is with Maeve's sacrifice. She was holding on to Soldier Boy in the air when he exploded, so she should have lost her powers instantly, just like anyone else. Now she's a normal human. A normal human Maeve is now free-falling from Vaught's skyscraper. Surely I don't need to explain how dead she should be from this fall. Even if she still had her powers on the way down, and then lost her powers on impact for some reason, she should still be dead, or at least have every bone in her body broken. When she did have her powers, the show established as far back as season 1 that Maeve's body was not that durable. She revealed to Starlight that in her earlier years in the Seven, she carried a school bus to stop it from falling, but in result, she broke every bone in her right arm and it never fully healed still to this day. If she's not strong enough to lift a school bus without destroying her arm, how is she suddenly strong enough to live through smacking into the concrete at a high velocity, suffering nothing but a broken arm? And remember, before she grabbed Soldier Boy, she had just finished getting a beating from Homelander, along with him gouging her eye out. So she wasn't really in the best of shape when she took that fall. So, similar to the Huey Starlight issues I brought up earlier, while researching for this video, I was glad to see many other viewers notice this blatant Deus Ex Machina too. The discourse surrounding it caught Kripke's attention. However, his response to why Maeve miraculously survived this ordeal, breaking all logic and world-building rules created by the show itself, was a bit mind-boggling to say the least. In an interview with various news outlets, he said the following, and I quote, "Obviously, we didn't want to kill her and fall into the trope of gay characters and bisexual characters in shows getting killed. We wanted to do the opposite of that and send her off and give her a happy ending with Elena. The best way to do that was, well, take away her powers and she's not useful in the fight anymore. End quote. So, first off, when has this ever been a trope? In all my experience consuming media, modern and old, I have never seen nor heard of this oddly specific trope until right now. And in all my years seeing online discourse, usually getting outrage about every single piece of media ever released, I've never seen a single person even slightly refer to this trope Kripke is talking about. And with Western society's general acceptance of the LGBT community, how many shows were getting away with killing only LGBT characters so frequently and without any backlash that it became a trope? And I say only LGBT because it can't really be considered a trope if non-LGBT characters are also dying in that same show. So even if this trope Kripke's talking about actually exists, the boys wouldn't fall into that category anyways because tons of non-LGBT characters have been killed off since the first episode of this show. So I would have loved it if during the interview, Kripke gave examples of shows and movies that released in at least the last 10 years that are guilty of this trope. Because right now, it looks to me, and many others who watch this show, that Kripke breaking his own logic he introduced a few episodes prior to magically save a character's life, simply because of who she's into, makes him no different than the very corporations he makes fun of in his own show. The ones who prop up minorities, not because they actually care about them, but to virtue signal as if they do to trick people dumb enough to fall for it into buying their products. Kinda like Vought. But let's say Kripke is right and it is a prevalent trope happening all across our media. Why then would Kripke and his team write a scene like this in the first place? Why have Maeve sacrifice her well-being in such a way that makes no sense for her to survive according to in-universe rules and logic established by the very same writing team? If they wanted Maeve to have a happy ending with Elena so badly, they should have killed off Homelander in the season 3 finale instead of looking for excuses to keep him alive to stretch out the show's longevity. And I'll get to my thoughts on Homelander this season in a bit, but back on topic, the narrative would have been so much stronger had Maeve died in the end. And let me go over why, by starting at the beginning. Since season 1, she's been pretty nihilist, but that got worse as the show went on. She still feels guilty for the inhumane things she's done with Homelander, even if he coerced her into doing it. Homelander outed her as bisexual and doxed her girlfriend's name on live TV out of spite because she essentially left him for a woman. Vought, in turn, tried to monetize off her sexuality, leading to Maeve and Elena's relationship getting strained due to their loss of privacy. And now Maeve is scared for Elena's safety because of the risk of Homelander hurting or killing Elena if he ever feels like it. And as if it couldn't get any worse, Elena came across a cell phone video recording of Maeve and Homelander abandoning the passengers of the plane that was about to crash back in season 1. Maeve tried to explain she was going to use it as leverage against Homelander, but the damage was done. Elena fled their house in fear of what she saw, effectively ending their relationship for good and setting Maeve in a self-destructive spiral. At this point, Maeve had nothing left in her life worth living for, except Starlight. Throughout the show, Starlight looked to her as a sort of mentor and protector, and Maeve looked at Starlight as a spark of hope. The same hope she probably used to have herself earlier in life before having it shattered by the reality that she's surrounded by debaucherous, morally bankrupt psychopaths with superpowers, like her ex-Homelander for example. And each season, we've seen Maeve drop her apathetic demeanor to defend Starlight despite knowing the risks to her own well-being. So it's only fitting, and much stronger narrative-wise, that Maeve dies when pushing Soldier Boy out the window. In that moment, she comes to terms with the fact that she has nothing good left in her life, either due to her own choices or the choices of malicious people around her. But thanks to her sacrifice, she gives Starlight one final chance at life, for her hope to continue living on and not get snuffed out, figuratively and literally. You can even tell she only cared about Starlight. In the slow-mo scene when Soldier Boy was about to explode, we see things from Maeve's perspective, and after realizing the situation, who does she look at before making her ultimate decision? Starlight. Maeve's death would have had two very important impacts to the overall narrative moving forward. 1. Her freedom from Homelander's tyranny and spitting in his face of getting what he wants. Not only did she get the last hits on him before running to Soldier Boy, he wasn't able to harvest her eggs for his sick fantasy of having her kid. And 2, Starlight's maturity. Now that Maeve's gone, she no longer has a guardian angel to protect her anymore. She has to keep her wits about her, learn how to better utilize her powers to become stronger and be better at fending for herself. And finally, she has to keep her hopeful and optimistic attitude alive. Because the day she loses all hope in life is the day she accepts Maeve died for absolutely nothing. So keeping Maeve alive instead absolutely destroys these two narrative potentials. Now you might think those 2 points can still be valid even with Maeve alive since she's keeping a low profile with Elena now. But you have to admit, because she's alive, the temptation is there for the writers to shoehorn her back into the show. For the first point I made, they could easily write Homelander into learning Maeve's alive and finding her location due to him stalking Elena for whatever reason, or due to his super hearing, X-ray vision, and great influence in Vought and the public, which puts Maeve and Elena in danger again. And this isn't far-fetched. We've seen him do this countless times throughout the show, whether it was stalking Madeline Stillwell, finding out where Vought hid Rebecca and Ryan, finding out Victoria Newman was both a Soup and Stan Edgar's adopted daughter, and so much more. And as for my second point, the writers could easily have Starlight go to Maeve whenever she's dealing with a problem and needs a solution. There's nothing wrong with getting a handout, but we've gone through 3 seasons of Maeve bailing out Starlight. She needs to be fully independent at this point. The writers keeping Maeve alive instead of killing her off is like Starlight keeping the training wheels of a bicycle in storage in case she decides to use them again, instead of throwing them out and moving on. And if you think I'm overthinking it and creating conspiracy theories here, The Boys' showrunner Eric Kripke himself admitted in an interview with Deadline that Maeve will return to the show in some capacity. In what way? He didn't say. But he did also confirm that Black Noir is dead and teased he'll be replaced in the show. With who? Who knows? Maybe a clone of Homelander like the comic book Black Noir was. Or they'll use Maeve by saying she was impregnated by Butcher and gives birth to a Soup child who can age quickly or be able to transform like Shazam to resemble an adult so the show doesn't need a large time skip. And since he'll be covered in the Black Noir suit, no one could tell the difference. The possibilities are endless. But at least out of the 3 members of the 7 who died, Black Noir's death wasn't a fake out. And speaking of Black Noir's death, I've gotta say, that was the most garbage death scene in this show. Now, I definitely knew Noir was gonna die this season after learning about his backstory with Soldier Boy, but I thought his death would be by Soldier Boy's hands. There was so much buildup between the two of them, and we've seen how effortlessly Soldier Boy dispatched his former teammates. Granted, the Payback members he killed were all decades past their prime, while Black Noir was the only one still physically active and honing his combat skills. So it would have been satisfying to see Soldier Boy fight a former Payback member who actually could fight back. Not only that, it'd be just as satisfying to see Black Noir face his fears and stand up to the guy who tormented him decades ago. Just imagine if at the final showdown, Black Noir was standing there with Homelander. Homelander defends Noir from Soldier Boy since he's the only person he's known and trusted since childhood. He then tries to further convince Soldier Boy to forget about Noir and focus on his new family, revealing Ryan as his grandson. And then the rest of the scene plays out like the show. While Homelander and Maeve are fighting, Noir unintentionally teams up with the boys to take down Soldier Boy, forcing the boys to put aside their beef with Noir since they temporarily have the same goal. Even if Noir died, which I had no doubts he would, at least he'd die fighting, instead of cowering and running in fear until the day Soldier Boy found where he's hiding, like what he did in episode 7 before he got a burst of courage to fight back. So having Homelander kill Black Noir like this was such a wasted opportunity. Noir and Soldier Boy didn't even at least get to meet in person again after all these years. I get they wanted to follow the modern trend in media of subverting expectations, but if the writers really wanted to keep in Homelander killing Noir for hiding secrets about his father, then they could have written Noir's death in a more satisfying way than what we actually got. In a slightly alternate version of that Black Noir fight scene I made up earlier, have Black Noir fight Soldier Boy for a while and give a false impression to the audience that Noir might win. It would also symbolize him taking down his fears once and for all. But then, Homelander swoops in and kills Noir. Soldier Boy asks why he did that, and Homelander gives the same answer he gave in the season finale.
Because he didn't tell me about you.
To be honest, I still wouldn't like it if it played out this way. But at least the writers get what they want by having Noir's death be by Homelander's hands, while also allowing Noir and Soldier Boy to have their final face-off. In my opinion, Soldier Boy had an excellent introduction to the live-action series. He was a well-written character with likable traits, flaws, and interesting backstory. Also helps that his actor, Jensen Ackles, has great charisma and plays off the other actors smoothly. But despite this, Soldier Boy's overall potential was underdeveloped. This is due to the fact the show likes to introduce things about him or his past that be interesting to flesh out, but then moves on and never mentions again. And if they do mention it, it comes down to a 2-second conversation and is quickly forgotten about with no lasting impact on the rest of the show. For example, the relationship between Soldier Boy and his young sidekick Gunpowder. It's obvious their dynamic is supposed to parody established heroes we know of, such as Batman and Robin, or Captain America and comic book Bucky. But as we know of the boys by this point, their manner of parodying has always been laced with dark humor or disturbing topics. This is true for both the show and the comics, more so the comics. And we see this form of dark parody when Butcher first met Gunpowder in the bathroom and made inappropriate remarks to him, implying Soldier Boy was a pedophile who sexually abused Gunpowder. Knowing Butcher's character, he obviously said it to get under Gunpowder's skin and make him reveal secret info about Soldier Boy's supposed death and the whereabouts of the soup gun that can kill any soup it's used on. But even though Gunpowder denied Butcher's accusations, the way he delivered his lines gave the impression Butcher's remarks may have had some truth to them. And when Butcher, now souped up, met Gunpowder again from the last time, he kept bringing up his accusation about Soldier Boy and made jokes about it too.
Why are you protecting Soldier Boy?
If he'd have slipped me a length, I wouldn't hesitate. I'd throw him to the fucking dogs.
At that point, if the show is going that hard to bring attention to a sensitive topic like that, it's easy for anyone to think it'll play a role in the story, like how the main characters would treat Soldier Boy throughout the show. But instead, it led nowhere. We never get any confirmation or proper follow-up since Butcher kills Gunpowder soon after this conversation, nor do we get Soldier Boy's side of the story, either from his mouth or from any of the various flashbacks that happened throughout the season. In the present day, Gunpowder is brought up by Butcher in a conversation with Soldier Boy where he admits he killed him, and all Soldier Boy says is this:
I even sorted Gunpowder for you.
Why am I supposed to be impressed with that? It's like killing Emmanuel Lewis.
Yeah, well, he grew up a bit since you last saw him.
Hands off the fucking shield.
Anyway.
And that's the only line he ever says about Gunpowder for the rest of the show. So we never get a conclusion on that. And what about the season finale where Starlight and Kimiko manage to pin down Soldier Boy, MM sedates him using the neurotoxin Novichok, which by the way is extremely deadly to non-soups. So how did MM survive gassing Soldier Boy when the gas mask carrying Novichok was flailing around in his face and MM was close enough to inhale it? Anyways, when MM was gassing Soldier Boy, he called him a racist. But how exactly is Soldier Boy a racist? What's he done that makes him racist? We know MM hates him because he unintentionally killed his grandfather decades ago due to his recklessness, but that doesn't make him racist. All the former members of Payback Soldier Boy killed were all white. Ironically, Black Noir, the only black member of the team, was not killed by Soldier Boy. They never even got to meet again in person before Noir died. He also praises black celebrities. He even called Bill Cosby an example of a real man and America's dad.
Bill Cosby is America's dad, and I'll tell you one thing, he wouldn't be caught dead in that pussy gear. Cos. That's a real man. Holy shit, did he make some strong drinks.
Obviously, he doesn't know about Cosby's current situation. He basically carried the same opinion most of us did of Cosby until the mid-2010s, minus the strong drinks part.
Do you like my sunglasses? I wear sunglasses because my idol, Dr. Bill Cosby, wears sunglasses all the time. You know what they say, Cosbiness is next to godliness.
The only thing you can really bring up is what the legend tells the boys about Soldier Boy's past. Vought, in tandem with the US government, had used him decades ago to conduct black ops and civil rights atrocities, basically like what Black Noir's been doing throughout the show. One of the things the legend mentions is Soldier Boy being made to hose down protesters at the Birmingham protests in 1963. For those who don't know, here's a quick summary. The Birmingham protest, or officially known as the Birmingham Campaign, was a protest led by Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to fight for integration in Birmingham, Alabama. There was more to this event, but as I said, this is just a super quick summary so I don't go on too long a tangent. The point is, the majority of the protesters were African American, meaning most of the people who were hosed that day were African American. You may think this is definitive proof of Soulja Boy being racist. However, the legend also says another Black Ops Soulja Boy took part in was killing Kent State University students protesting against the US's involvement in the Vietnam War in 1970. Since the show integrates real-life events, it's safe to refer to our own history unless different details are stated by the show itself. In the real-life Kent State massacre, nearly all protesters were white. Those who were murdered and injured by the National Guard were also white. I say nearly all in case there were non-white protesters that just weren't shown in any photographs or mentioned in witness testimonies. But I bring this up because despite the show and some of its fans touting Soulja Boy as a racist, the writers seem to go out of their way to both tell us and show us countless examples of him being much more brutal and violent to those who share the same skin color as him than those who don't. Keep in mind, this is the first and last time this bombshell about Soulja Boy being racist is ever brought up. In the last few minutes of the last episode of the season. You see what I mean? And yeah, Soulja Boy is from the 1900s, so you could assume he's intolerant of others, but that's all you can do. Assume. Just as they were racist back then, there were also people who weren't. And based on his behavior in the present day, you can't 100% tell if he was or not unless the show gave us more flashbacks about him. We had two different flashback scenes this season involving Soulja Boy, the Nicaragua flashback and the animated one from Black Noir's Memories. Why didn't the writers take advantage of the two best opportunities they had to flesh out these traits they teased about Soulja Boy? Well, it would turn out that before Season 3 aired, it was revealed in an interview that Jensen Ackles refused to do a certain scene. He said, and I quote, "As a father of 3, and a son and a husband and a self-respecting human being, I can't do this." End quote. Showrunner Eric Kripke added on to that by saying this, "We worked out a compromise where I got what I needed without him destroying his soul." End quote. To this day, we still don't know what scene Ackles had a problem with and refused to shoot. Based on him bringing up his kids and being a father, you could assume he's talking about a scene with a younger Gunpowder that would have cemented his character as a pedophile. However, Kripke's remark about making a compromise wouldn't make sense in this case. The closest thing to a quote-unquote compromise would be Butcher making jokes about Gunpowder's supposed sexual abuse, which really isn't an appropriate compromise to exploring the context behind a dark deed another character is the perpetrator of. Even if that was what Ackles had an issue with and Kripke made a compromise for, there's still the random racism allegation MM made to Soulja Boy that goes unexplained. You know what? For all we know, maybe the scene Ackles had a problem with was shooting a sex scene with elderly women. I mean, look at the scene where Huey and Butcher walk in on Soulja Boy with two old ladies. They're all naked, but instead of having any sort of intercourse, or even physical touch, Soulja Boy sits far away from them and they all just pleasure themselves while looking at each other. However, all dialogue surrounding this scene suggests he has actual sex with the women. Maybe having sex with them was the scene Ackles refused to do, so Kripke shot this scene instead as the compromise. With this, Kripke's statement about making a compromise makes the most sense here. And going back to Ackles' quote, he went out of his way to mention both being a father and his marital status as a husband when detailing his refusal to do the mysterious scene. And further research into his background revealed he's also a non-denominational Christian. So being asked to shoot a scene fornicating with other women would be a problem, especially while married. This is all circumstantial, of course. He never explicitly said these things, so I can only make an educated guess. But him having these religious beliefs, combined with his and Kripke's statements, further prove the argument that this may be the very scene Ackles was uncomfortable doing. And based on online discourse I've seen during my research, it's clear I'm not the only one who came to this conclusion either. But whatever the scene was he was uncomfortable with, it only accounts for one scene. One compromised scene can only explain away one inconsistency. This opens the floodgates for other loose plot threads to be pointed out. For example, what about the part where the legend tells the boys that Soulja Boy is a fraud who never served in the army? First off, it's fine and all if the writers want to make out Soldier Boy to be a fraud who's stealing valor, because it fits in the world of The Boys where the heroes people look up to are all fake in their own ways. But his behavior seems pretty inconsistent with an army fraud. Any army fraud wouldn't want to be put in an active hot zone because not only do they have no training to handle being in such a situation, but they'd also be scared out of their minds. So why is Soldier Boy so calm and collected in battles like the one in Nicaragua? Why does he feel no remorse for the countless lives and families he ruined due to his recklessness when patrolling on the streets?
You killed my family.
Which one?
And yeah, I know he's practically an indestructible soup who doesn't have to worry about getting hurt, but witnessing the bloodshed, him killing people, killing innocents, and seeing dead bodies all around him don't faze him? Ironically, the only PTSD he ever got was from the Russians torturing him, something that didn't involve him being in any battles or conflicts. And while we're on the topic of him being indestructible, why didn't Vought allow him to be more involved in the army and actually get to see some action instead of appearing when the wars are already over? Throughout the entire show, Vaught's goal has always been to monetize their Compound V and Temp V formulas by getting the US military to consider buying it and using it on their soldiers. If Vought succeeds, this would open the door to other nations wanting to buy from them too in order to even the playing field. Basically the equivalent of a nuclear deterrent. War is a never-ending aspect of both our world and the world of the boys, so this chain reaction would make Vought the largest amount of consistent profit virtually forever. Knowing all this, I'm sure you'd have the same question I asked earlier. If Vought had pushed Soldier Boy and his team Payback to be involved in military battles throughout the years, they could have used the combat data to convince the US government into buying Compound V for its military, and Vaught's goal would have been achieved decades ago. Instead, according to the legend, in a blink and you'll miss it scene, not only was Vought already in leagues with the US government, they both also had Soldier Boy commit civil rights atrocities on US soil. Why would Vought want their first American soup, basically their golden child, take part in events that would be photographed and possibly recorded on live video? Even if Vought was powerful enough back then to control the media and hide things like that, why take the risk in the first place? Vought has more to lose than gain engaging in domestic situations like Birmingham and Kent State. In fact, it's kinda silly to think Vought and the US government would agree to get a soup involved to begin with when the police and National Guard were more than capable of committing atrocities themselves. It's like going up to Superman, when he could be out fighting supervillains, and asking him to help get cats out of trees around the city, when a regular guy with a ladder could have taken care of it. While we're at it, if everything the legend said about Soldier Boy's past and Vaught's and the US government's alliance is all true, then this gets into major plot hole territory because it means Vought already partially got what they wanted towards their global arms dealing scheme. If that's the case, why is it that in seasons 1 and 2, Vought seemed to be starting at square one in achieving their goals? Yet according to the legend, they were, apparently, already on great terms with the US government decades ago. So as you can see, on their own, these loose threads aren't such a big deal. But when it's one after the other, you start to see them snowball into the greater issue I stated at the start of this chapter. The title of this chapter basically says it all. The power levels of the characters this season were pretty inconsistent. For example, as awesome as it was to see Butcher fight Homelander in the Herogasm episode, how was he able to hurt him in any capacity? When V-24 and its properties were introduced to the show, I was under the impression that although it gave a person superpowers, it wouldn't make them as powerful as a soup who got Compound V. Granted, without Soldier Boy and Huey's help in the fight, Butcher would have died. So honestly, I can let that slide. Just thought I'd at least point that out. But there's another nitpick about him I can't let slide as easily. And I'm gonna have to go on a bit of a tangent here, so follow me for a second. Get this. Butcher used to be a soldier for the British Army, and, just like any army around the world, they teach their soldiers some form of martial arts or hand-to-hand combat. Plus, after the army, when he started working for the CIA to keep soups in check, Butcher's gotten used to fighting and beating up both normal people and lesser-powered soups, essentially honing his skills. Homelander, on the other hand, has been so used to being the strongest in the world all his life, he's never had any reason to learn to fight with his fists. Instead, he mainly relies on his laser vision to end every situation and rarely uses his hands because he hates getting his costume dirty with people's blood. So why was Butcher having trouble beating Homelander in the hand-to-hand department? Knowing both of their backgrounds in fighting, and Butcher being as strong and durable as Homelander thanks to Temp V, you'd think Butcher would at least have the upper hand at the start. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Now that all the hype's died down, watch that first part of the fight again. Butcher is fighting as if it's its first time in one. Butcher throws two weird-looking weak punches and one headbutt, while Homelander is absolutely demolishing Butcher. And the editors use the same sound effects as they hit each other to give off the impression Butcher hits as hard as Homelander, yet it doesn't look like it on screen. Everyone who watched this scene for the first time convinced themselves into thinking Butcher was winning at the start because the show was building up to this moment so hard that when it finally happened, people subconsciously put on rose-tinted glasses and saw what they wanted to see. And I can't blame them for doing that. I was one of them. But when you remove all the hype, the build-up, and the intense music playing in the background, what you're really watching is a one-sided beatdown on Butcher's end. And with that, that's the end of my little rant about Butcher. Now, back to the main topic, the power level inconsistency between people who got their powers from Temp V versus those who got them from Compound V. It makes me wonder, if Butcher and Huey on Temp V are strong enough to hurt Homelander, why does every Supe who was born with Compound V practically fear the man? If members of the Seven hated him so much, they could have jumped him years ago and killed him then. For example, even though Homelander was going easy on Maeve in the season finale, she was still able to nearly kill him in a one-on-one fight. Look at when Maeve shoved a metal rod down Homelander's ear. Based on the amount of force it looked like Homelander used to pull it out, along with the amount of blood gushing out of his ear, and the sound effect used when Maeve lodged it in his ear, it's clear Maeve shoved the rod so far down his ear, she stabbed his eardrums. And if she wasn't so battered and was at full strength instead, she probably would have pierced his brain and killed him right there. Soldier Boy, Butcher, and Huey jumped this man together in a 3-on-1, and the best they could do to him was a bruise. Maeve takes him on in a 1-on-1 and has him bleeding all over? I'm surprised Homelander didn't have nightmares of Maeve the day after like he did with Soldier Boy. Perhaps that was the seduction of toxic masculinity at work. It compelled Homelander to only fear another man and never a woman. Speaking of seductions and toxic masculinity, let's go back to that good old Insider article I had a lot to say about back in the Huey Starlight chapter of this video. Because in it, the showrunner, Eric Kripke, talked about Maeve's fight against Homelander and straight up says Maeve would have won, meaning killing Homelander, had the fight kept going. If Maeve is so strong she could have killed Homelander, what was the point of her leading Butcher on a fetch quest this season to find Soldier Boy? Why didn't she just give Butcher some Temp V and have them both pull up to Vought Tower the same day? Or better yet, what was the point of this entire show? The main plot revolved around the boys taking down the Seven, specifically Homelander, but since Maeve has shown she could absolutely solo him without any help, and the boys' showrunner co-signed that she could too, why didn't she just take him out in season 1? And if Maeve was apparently always that strong, it makes me wonder if our favorite head popper, Victoria Newman, was also strong enough to pop Homelander's head. Since the writers have essentially broken their established power levels by making Homelander so weak in these 2 episodes, especially this one, why not ask the question? She might as well have tried. She probably would have succeeded. But then we'd have no show if she did, now would we? All I've done throughout this video is point out issues with the show this season, but I'd like to end this video with some optimism and give out my hopes for the upcoming season 4. And we have a lot of time to do that since Kripke intentionally delayed it in support of the Writers and Actors Guild strike, which is strange because his spin-off show is releasing on time, so I guess the virtue only goes so far. Anyways, my first hope. In the comics, part of its ending had Homelander storm the White House with an army of Supes to kill the president and take over the world. And I know the show follows the comics very loosely, but now that season 3's ended with Homelander having his own fanbase that's just as radical, or maybe even more, than Starlight's fanbase, I'm hoping the writers will take advantage of real-life current events and satirize them here in combination with elements from the comics. Specifically, I'm talking about our real-life society's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Speaking just for America, at the height of the COVID pandemic, when a vaccine against the virus was made available to the public, the American population was divided. One side supported taking the vaccine to help end the pandemic as soon as possible, The other side believed the vaccine was an experimental, fatal concoction that's dangerous to the human body because it was new and came out so fast, even though it was produced that fast because the greatest scientists and medical organizations across the world worked together to make it. They also believed it was a form of government tyranny when the government enacted temporary mandates to take it. After mid-2020, most Americans who were for the vaccine politically aligned with the left, while most of those who were against it were on the right. Kripke and his writing team could make a reverse allegory for that situation by having Homelander, a character who's been written to align with right-wingers, learn about the existence of Temp V and convince his followers to take shots of it to fight against Vought and the government, while Starlight, a character who's been written to align with left-wingers, pleads with her followers to avoid taking the Temp V shot because it's a relatively new concoction made by Vought that's still experimental, and she knows taking it is extremely dangerous because too many doses will lead to fatality. Homelander can easily manipulate his followers by dismissing Starlight's warnings as fake news or conspiracy theory, especially thanks to Vought ruining Starlight's reputation through their news networks in Season 3. Again. All of this will create a new problem for the boys to solve this upcoming season, along with dealing with Victoria Newman running to be vice president under Bob Singer to rule over America. And speaking of Victoria Newman, for my second hope, I'm hoping she'll evolve from being an AOC parody to a parody of another influential person in politics, Kamala Harris. Now that she's running as the new vice president under Bob Singer due to the unfortunate, and totally accidental and not suspiciously timed, death of the original running VP, the image of Newman and Singer together strikes an uncanny resemblance to our current president and vice president, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. In early to mid-2021, sometime after the start of Biden's presidency, people began to believe Vice President Harris was the actual person who was truly handling presidential duties from behind the scenes due to people seeing President Biden's issues in various press conferences, events, interviews, and so on. After seeing Newman's true colors in the finale of Season 2 and her actions throughout Season 3, it's clear she's a master manipulator who learned from the best. It wouldn't be that far-fetched to say she'd do the same manipulating on a nationwide scale if she and Bob Singer win the presidential election. Again, similar to what people believe Kamala Harris was doing under Joe Biden's presidency around the start of his run. And when she runs into complications doing things behind the scenes, such as Singer getting in the way or becomes aware of things she didn't want him to know, I'm sure everyone watching this video, including myself, expects Newman to assassinate Singer and take over as president. And with her doing what she wants with all that power, and without people like Stan Edgar to put her in her place, Homelander may not like where she's going with things. Or for example, Newman might enact policies that are detrimental to him in some way. So Homelander, probably with the help of Edgar, would rally up his followers to take Temp V and storm the White House to stop or kill Newman for the glory of America or whatever excuse he comes up with. And the only reason he doesn't swoop in there and kill her himself is because he cares so much about his public image, so he doesn't want his followers to see him as just a bloodthirsty animal. Instead, he'd rather rile up his fans to do the bloodthirsty stuff so he'll look more like a patriotic freedom fighter. Funnily enough, showrunner Eric Kripke and the writers could also use the White House event in the comics to satirize the real-world Capitol Hill riot that occurred on January 6th of 2021. Now, my third hope is actually in regard to the Gen V spin-off show. At the time of recording, the show hasn't come out yet, but by the time this video comes out, at least its first 3 episodes should have already premiered. I've only seen the trailers so far, but I do know this show will be loosely inspired by Garth Ennis' spin-off comic book run of The Boys called We Gotta Go Now. This run introduced the G-Men, an obvious parody of Marvel's X-Men, but as per usual with The Boys, it's a dark parody. The G-Men are made up of children and teenagers. Their leader is John Godolkin, an obvious reference to Charles Xavier. However, unlike the X-Men, kids don't join the G-Men due to being born with a special gene giving them powers. Instead, John Godolkin gets new members by kidnapping kids at random and injecting them with Compound V. Those who survive the ordeal join the G-Men. But in exchange for their newfound powers, Godolkin gets to sexually abuse each child whenever he wants. In result, some minors, like Silver Kincaid, would attempt to take their own lives to escape the abuse Godolkin brings to them. Garth Ennis wrote both this and the main story of The Boys to be edgy for the sake of being edgy, and because of his overall hatred of superheroes because he got fed up with writing generic superhero stories for years at the time he made this comic. So what I hope for the Gen V show is they take a different turn from the comics like they've done for The Boys. The showrunners can follow some aspects of it, like the headmaster being an abuser who takes advantage of stray children in exchange for superpowers, But instead of the story abruptly ending with Vought killing Godolkin and his victims to prevent his sick actions from becoming public, like in the comics, the overall plot of the show could instead be about the students rising up against their abuser and using their powers to take him down so he can never traumatize another child again. Based on the first trailer of the show, it's going to take place in a university, again similar to the comics, making the concept I just came up with a pretty feasible plotline the writers can pursue. Despite my gripes with Season 3 of The Boys, Eric Kripke and his team have, overall, done a great job making an adaptation miles better than its source material, and handling dark topics introduced in the source material flawlessly in said adaptation. So I have hope they'll do this show justice. However, at the same time I'm writing this script, I had to make this last minute addition because the second trailer for Gen V just now released. And it's starting to look more like a generic teen drama show from what I can tell. But thanks to Kripke's work so far, I'm willing to give him and his team the benefit of the doubt and give the show a chance before making any final judgments. With that, the last thing I hope for Season 4 is that it's the last season. We follow the show this long mainly because of the rivalry between Billy Butcher and Homelander. Each season's overall plot centered on that rivalry, so naturally, killing Homelander will bring a definite end to this series. It's honestly why I thought it'd end at Season 3. As entertaining and profitable the show has been so far, it has to come to an end soon, or else its story will feel dragged out. Knowing when to end a great story determines the difference between an unforgettable show and a show most people forgot is still airing because it's been going on for so long they lost interest in it. Butcher is dying soon, and his team are finally fed up with him. Victoria Newman will most definitely be vice president, and possibly president when or if Bob Singer coincidentally dies after winning the election. Homelander is starting to rally up an army of radical fans who clearly seem willing to commit any violence in his name and turn a blind eye to any of his wrongdoings, all of which will negatively influence his son Ryan. And Ryan is still a young, impressionable boy who's desperate for a loving father figure after the death of his mother, and after Butcher destroyed their relationship by blaming him for his mother's death in an unnecessarily cruel and twisted way of keeping him away from the dangers him and the boys were going to face throughout Season 3. Everything's coming to a head. The ending of Season 3 made it clear the show's nearing its end as it's starting to resemble the end of the original comic run, so let's hope that will be the case. Because it'd get pretty ridiculous if the writers found some way to keep Homelander alive for the boys to keep fighting, as if he's nothing more than a recurring villain you'd see in any superhero cartoon. And as I said earlier, Homelander's the main reason we followed this show for so long, since the overall plot revolves so much around him and Butcher. So making Victoria Newman, or someone else be the next big bad to carry a theoretical Season 5 is a huge sell. And to be honest, I think Victoria should also die in Season 4. Although she injected her daughter with Compound V and gave her powers, it'd be great if this season, her daughter decided to use her new powers for the good of humankind in the end instead of following in her mother's footsteps. It'd also serve as a nice juxtaposition to Ryan following in his dad's footsteps simply because he feels Homelander's the only one left who genuinely loves him. But at the end of the day, this should all be wrapped up in this coming season. Even if some plot threads, like Newman's child, end up getting neglected, as long as the main plotline with Homelander is addressed in full, I'll still be satisfied. Because the stuff with Newman's child could always be addressed in the Gen V spin-off show if they really wanted. For example, depending on her age or if they'll use a time skip, the writers could easily reintroduce her in Gen V as a new student of the Godolkin University. Because if The Boys somehow gets its plot dragged out enough into having a 5th season, or a 6th or a 7th, I just don't think I'll have the patience to entertain this. Oh my god.